stage of life has come to an end. Somebody that made a huge impact on us has gone to be with the Lord. And at the same time, there is a great reason to celebrate because this is a life that was worth living. And Dr. Joe made a huge impact on all of us. As a starter, we talked about reading through the obituary, the things that have been published, and realized that it's way too long, and Dr. Joe would have been very upset if we took that much time at the beginning of this celebration. So that is online if you would like to read Dr. Joe's family history and the amazing things he has been part of. We welcome you to do that. Today we're just going to keep this very simple and kind of old school. You should have been given a program as you walked in. We're just going to go take these things in the order in which they come. Ross Goodman is going to be leading us in songs at various points throughout the next 45 minutes or so. Bill Harlan will talk about family memories. Jack Williams will talk about memories at UT. John Sheridan will talk about the impact on the community, and then I will close this out by talking about Joe's impact as a friend of the church. Thank you for being here.
Would you all join me? Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, early in the morning our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns around the crystal sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, who wast and art and evermore shalt be. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, all thy works shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Harlan. I'm the son-in-law of Joe and Pat Johnson, and on behalf of my wife, his daughter Kelly Harlan, and Pat Johnson, my mother-in-law, his sister Diane, and my boys, I want to welcome you to this celebration of life of Dr. Joe Johnson. Thank you. First of all, I want to share a few recollections and memories of Joe as it relates to his relationship with family. Joe was born in 1933 to Clarence and Anna Banks Johnson in Lamar County, Alabama. What rural Lamar County lacked in affluence, it was rich in the bonds of family and storytelling that rivaled anything that Harper Lee or Rick Bragg could conjure up. If you don't believe me, just listen to a few stories about Joe. One of the things that I think is really amazing in the beginning in his early history is that Joe's father and mother ran a grocery store, and they lived in this store with his sister Diane. As a matter of fact, to give some perspective, the kitchen and living areas were on the first floor and were at the back of that store, and the bedrooms were right up above the store. He did not have any electricity or water until he was age 14. He had the great benefit of living with both sets of grandparents in his community, and those stories that he probably shared with many of you. You probably have heard the legends of Big Mama and Big Daddy Shelton somewhere along the way. His sister Diane is 11 years younger than Joe. They moved to Hueytown, Alabama, when Joe was a senior in high school. As we talked about the memories of Joe, one thing that stood out for her was her adoration and admiration for her big brother. She remembers being a little girl and laying on his bed when he was at home studying when he was a student at Birmingham Southern College. When he went to Korea, and I need to correct my pronunciation, that is Korea if you are from Hueytown, Alabama, she remembers how he bought her this beautiful set of pottery with an inlay of mother of pearl, which she still has to this day from Korea. Whenever Joe would come back to Birmingham, her mother would pull out the china and crystal, or what she thought was crystal, and have his favorite meal of fried chicken, fried okra, fresh-cut green beans, and corn, and a personal favorite, and I'm going to have to look this one up, Buffalo Rock Ginger Ale. On that note, Diane continued to share stories of how if she was ever in need of anything, he was only one phone call away. When she was either in junior high or high school, she had made the cheerleading squad, but her mother said to Diane, "We just can't afford all these cheerleading outfits." Kind of sounds like modern day, doesn't it? Joe called and told Diane, "I'm paying for those uniforms." And she was part of that cheerleading squad. Even if she didn't ask, Joe would always say, "Now, I'd like to pay for this for you or for your girls." And even in their own mother's last days, she knew that all she had to do was pick up the phone and call Joe, and he would be there in a day or two and be right there for her. It's hard to think about Joe Johnson without thinking about Pat Johnson. They were the model of a great marriage and a great relationship. One of my favorite memories from my own marriage and marriage counseling was there's a great man by the name of Jim Bill McIntyre, who's a great friend to Joe and Pat, as all of you all are. And he told us, and he looked at us, and he said, the greatest gift of marriage is being able to talk to your spouse every day and talk about your day. And it is one of those things that Pat and Joe never took for granted. They always shared their day with each other. Even if they weren't in the same place the last couple of years, they picked up the phone and they called each other and they talked to each other about their day. As I became part of the family, I learned several things about Joe. He was curious about people and he was curious about places. That's how he got to know people. He enjoyed traveling, meandering, and in Diane's words, strolloping. I've never heard that word before, but Joe would be proud of that word, strolloping. Look it up. It's a fantastic Lamar County word. He loved a great meal, and he loved great conversation. And one of his favorite places to go with Pat was Blowing Rock, North Carolina. And as my son and his grandson Tucker noted, when he went to Blowing Rock, he never took the most direct route. He would always go first all the way up to Abingdon, Virginia, and eat lunch at Hartwood, and then he would cross over to Damascus, and he would make sure he stopped at the Abingdon Winery, and then he would come down to Mountain City, trade, then to Boone, and then finally would go up the mountain to Blowing Rock. He did this every year, multiple times a year. He would always call us about 6 months before the trip to invite us so that his secretaries could make reservations at Chatola. Also, he had reservations every single night at a very nice restaurant in which he wanted to go to. He enjoyed every meal, whether it was at the Boone Drug Store in Boone, North Carolina, or his favorite restaurant in the mountains, Artisanal. And at least one of the days while he was there, he would just drive around for hours to Little Switzerland, West Jefferson, Valley Crucis, no telling how many miles that Pat logged as his faithful companion. For our boys, they would spend a week by themselves with Joe and Pat, and following that trip to Blowing Rock, and that includes a night at the Christmas Inn in Buckberry Lodge in the mountains near Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg. They would make many trips to the Knoxville Zoo, the Museum of Appalachia, Oak Ridge Museum, Archaeological Dig in Gray, Tennessee, and many, many rounds of putt-putt in Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg. And as the boys got older, he would just simply park his car, because he was on a walker at that point. He had his 5 newspapers, because you all knew he liked to read everything. And he would just set them out there and let them play as long as they wanted to. Every time our boys came home from there, we had to do the customary grandparent detox, because they would have Sprite. Luke would have Sprite and Krispy Kreme for breakfast, and Tucker would have mountains of Mama Pat's famous grilled cheese and Mama Pat's famous chocolate chip cookies. While he enjoyed traveling and wandering, the essence of Joe Johnson was conversation at the table. You all know what I'm talking about. One of the greatest gifts that he left with me were the many conversations that I had with him. He was curious. He wanted to know what was going on in my home, my faith, my family, my school, my community, my church. He had always had a story to share and some nugget of wisdom to give me. And I am so grateful that I had 28 years with him to experience that. He gave me the inspiration to go into K-12 education and to become a leader there. He gave me the inspiration to become a better father and a better husband. He taught me about generosity, and he told me the 5 greatest words of leadership were, thank you, and I'm sorry. I'm proud to say that he left a legacy of gifts to his family and friends. I know he made everyone feel like they were the most special person in the world, but I'm telling you, only one person could make him light up the way that my wife made him light up. I'm going to tell you a funny story. She was so worried, Kelly was so worried that Joe was going to cry walking down the aisle. She leaned over to her father and she said, Dad, I'm wearing orange underwear. And to that, he just burst into laughter. Coach Fulmer, if you're here, that's the real reason why you all won the national championship. We got married in '98. To his daughter, he left leadership, loyalty, and the love of the King's English. And if you didn't know, my wife is an English teacher and a department chair at Centennial High School. She is a kid magnet, but also I would call her a warm demander. She gets the best out of her students, not to mention she's an incredible mother and spouse. To his son, Kent, he gave one of the highest intellects one would ever encounter, and a deep and genuine desire to help people. To Tucker, he gave you that baritone voice for radio, son, and an encyclopedic memory, a quick turn of the phrase and writing, and a love for the University of Tennessee. To Luke, what can I say, bud? He made you not only a great lover of good meals, he made you a great host and conversationalist. He gave you a generous spirit and thoughtfulness of others. To his wife, Pat, he gave you the gift of companionship and love. In return, you have given your life for him in his pursuit of excellence. You were his great confidant and listener. You will forever be his rock. To all of you, he gave the inspiration to serve your university, your local community, your community of faith, and your family. And I know right now he wishes you well, and he hopes that you have a great meal and great conversation so that you can remember the many great lessons of Joe Johnson. Thank you.
Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above.
I'm honored to be with you today. We're honoring a great man, and there's so many great individuals here. The obituary referred to common sense, wisdom, intellect. I might have added great courage and vocabulary. I think where the Bible says, if you'll pray and ask God for wisdom, he will liberally grant your wisdom. I told somebody I'd like to change that verse and say if you would ask for wisdom and common sense, he'll give liberally. I don't think we've ever needed common sense more than we do these days. I had the privilege one time in about 2015, I did an hour-long kind of interview. I didn't really do an interview. I gave Charlie Breakable some things to talk about. And then I did, a little later that summer, I did the same thing with Joe. And all I would do is I'd have 10 things, and he'd look at number one and think a minute or two, and then Doug Mills, of one of the videographers from the Heartland series, Doug would film what Joe was saying. And we talked for about 2 hours, went to lunch, came back, put Joe in a different location. So I've got about a 2-hour talk of Joe. And as I looked at this, I said, there's more stuff here. I could talk for 3 hours. Any one of you could tell, if we could each tell a favorite story of Joe, we'd be here till midnight at least. I don't want to do that. One thing Joe did say toward the end of that interview, he said, you know, my first ambition in life was to be an Alabama state trooper. And he didn't get over that till he got to Birmingham Southern. And he said, you know, in my career, this is 2015, I've had 26 speeding violations, and my car's been towed at least 3 times. Well, that was funny, and I thought, you know, God has a sense of humor. He made sure Joe was always connected to the highway patrol wherever he lived. Charlie Breakable had told me the story. One morning he was supposed to meet Joe precisely at 8 o'clock, just the two of them. Charlie lived in Loudon. He was coming up the boulevard, and the UT police had a radar gun set up, and they pulled Charlie over, and he was speeding. And the patrolman was writing the citation, and Joe said, you know, I'm awfully sorry I was speeding. He said, I've got an 8 o'clock meeting with Joe Johnson, and I don't want to be late. He said, Mr. Breakwell, we pulled Dr. Johnson over about 2 minutes ago. He's right there in that third car up. I love that story. Another thing, I wasn't going to tell this, but it's just too funny. Kelly, I hope you'll forgive me. For a little while, Joe was an executive assistant to Buford Ellington, the governor. And at the same time, Ed had hired him to work in the budget office, but he could do both jobs. And Buford Ellington always got to work very early, and sometimes he left early to go play golf. And one time he asked Joe, said, you know, we don't have a golf course down at Henry Horton State Park. I want you to put one in. Well, Joe didn't play golf. He worked with the architect. He and Pat went out there about every afternoon to see how the progress was going. And I believe there was an even incident where they blew the dynamite in the wrong place. But anyway, he gets the golf course built. But one morning when he got to work about 7:25, there were two little old ladies sitting outside his office with a bag. And Joe spoke to them, and he opened the door and turned the lights on and said, would you come on in? They came in, sat down. He said, how can I help you? They said, well, Mr. Johnson said, we've come to get our brother out of the state penitentiary. And Joe said, how long has he been there? He said, well, 7 or 8 months. What did he do? Well, he was convicted of a robbery. And they told us if we could just bring some money and you can make a phone call and we can drive home with our brother. And Joe got to thinking real quick, you know, it's bordering on a felony or whatever. I'm not a lawyer. And so he said, who told you to do this? She said, our lawyer in Knoxville. And Joe said, well, who's your lawyer? Well, she told him. Joe never told me the name of the lawyer. So he graciously, and I thought this showed compassion and understanding, rather than call the law and arrest them, he sent them home. He said, you just leave and go. And I believe they had $5,000 in the bag. And then he called the lawyer in Knoxville later that morning. And of course, the lawyer said, oh, I didn't tell him that. And he started hemming and hawing. You know, it wasn't his fault, but I thought that was an interesting story. There are a few people that changed Joe Johnson's life. Aside from some of his outstanding teachers he had, Joe graduated from Birmingham Southern with a degree in history and political science. And his major professor and advisor was a woman named Evelyn Wiley, and she was also his advisor. And his senior year, he went in, and he was going to take a couple of courses in education, and she said, Joe, why are you doing this? And he said, well, I want to get a teacher's certificate. Why? I want to make money. And she said, Joe, I'm not going to let you do that. I said, don't be a coward. She said, you get that degree in history. When you find a job, make sure you're working for the right people, but do the best you can, and the right people will lead you along to a career. He always praised Miss Evelyn Wiley. And she nominated him to participate in a program the TVA had started. It was called the Southern Regional Training Program. And 7 people from around the country were nominated. And the way to get a master's, and the way you did it, you spent a semester or a quarter at the University of Alabama, you spent a quarter at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and a quarter at the University of Kentucky. And then you would have an opportunity to choose where you wanted the master's degree from. And Joe had done his work, and Jim Martin, a man who was a great mentor to him, he had been the commissioner of all kinds of things in Kentucky. He would take a leave from Kentucky and go work for the governor. And he called Joe in and said, Joe, I'd like to have you come work for me. But he said, let me tell you, he said, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be meeting with Happy Chandler, the governor of Kentucky, and we're going to have a collision. And he said, I'm going to get fired, and if I've hired you, you'll get fired with me. So he said, I want you to go back to Knoxville and get your degree, get your master's degree. And Joe did that. When he was in Knoxville, he worked with Lee Green in political science. a very great man, had a great temper. I could tell you stories that Joe shared with me. But in 1959, Ed hired Joe to work in the budget office in Nashville. And one day he took Joe. Andy Holt loved to write letters. And he was kind of like Joe. If you met him, or particularly if you sent Dr. Holt a letter, he was going to write you back. And Dr. Holt was in the hospital at Vanderbilt, and Ed took Joe over. And Dr. Holt said, I know you're going to work for Ed, but he said, I want you to work for me also. And what you find in Joe's career, they were always adding something to his duties. And so Joe started writing letters for Dr. Holt, and he never heard back for 3 or 4 months. You know, how are my letters? You know, and he went to see Miss Betty Davis, and he explained, said, is there a problem with my letters? And she said, you know, there might be. So she arranged for him to see Dr. Holt, and Dr. Holt now was a PhD in English from Columbia. And at any rate, he talked to Joe, and he said, Joe said, are my letters not up to par? And he said, well, no. He said it in a nice way. But he started talking to him. He said, you know, when you see the word eagerly or anxiously, you need to know which word to use. And there's different ways to use commas and semicolons. And he went on, helping to make Joe a better writer. And Joe learned from that, because, you know, Dr. Holt would put at the letter, may your tribe increase, or something. You know, it was always something funny. And Joe learned to write for Dr. Holt. And then Dr. Holt said, Joe, you need to get a doctorate. And Joe said, why do I need to get a doctorate? He said, it'll make people think you're smarter than you are. I love that. So he did a doctorate. He studied under Al Keeley in industrial management and Howard Allman in educational administration. And he always said Al Keeley was the best lecturer he had ever heard. And Lee Green, backing up to Lee Green told him one time, he said, Joe, when he's working on his master's, he said, you're not going to be an academician. You're not going to be an intellectual or a writer. He said, you're going to be an administrator. And Joe never forgot that. Dr. Holt, he said, working with Dr. Holt was one of the greater blessings of his life. Dr. Holt told him to always hire people smarter than you and then turn them loose, but every now and again check on them just to make things. And if you have to make a correction or talk to them strictly about something, do it in private. He loved Ed Bowling. Ed Bowling he said Ed Bowling had more integrity than anybody I've ever known. I personally would say the same thing about Joe Johnson. But he valued Ed because of his integrity. Ed was honest, fair. He said, if you're doing something, make sure it's honest, it's fair, it's legal, and it's good for UT. He sent Joe, now this was a trial, he sent Joe early in his career in 1970 to Memphis and to serve as the interim chancellor. The chancellor had retired. He was a fine man, but during that time period, 10 years, he was a recluse. And nobody in Memphis outside of doctors and lawyers, or doctors and dentists, knew much about the medical center sitting right here on the edge of the city. And Joe knew he had to change that. The other thing, it was 1970, and racial tensions were very high in Memphis. The Med, which used to be John Gaston Hospital, was staffed by UT physicians who were all white. And the clientele was mostly African American. And so Joe got there, and he hired Kurt Simic. He knew they needed to start a fundraising program. And Kurt's with us today. He's probably the best collegiate fundraiser I've ever known. He went on to become president of the Indiana University Foundation. Still does some work for Indiana in retirement. But together they went to see the chairman of the, down at the, well, anyway, they visited with the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce in Memphis. And that man helped them to get 200 names of people that were prominent, some of the leading bankers and then the wealthy people. And Joe and Kurt began taking these people to breakfast or lunch or dinner, 3 or 4 at a time. And within a year, they had built strong relationships, and that's where Joe learned about the importance of building relationships. Joe also, along the way, lobbied for Dr. Bowling in Nashville. He lobbied in Washington, then he hired Walter Lambert, who was very bright, to help lobby. And along the way, I'll tell you 1 or 2 other brief stories. I've got too many to tell. He told me the story, or he tells the story, of building the Thompson Bowling Arena at UT. And after the World's Fair, there was a squabble as to the location. It was supposed to be on the World's Fair site with a hotel across Cumberland Avenue there, or it could be on this postage-sized place on campus. And the bids, the state, B. Ray Thompson had committed $5 million. And the state had some money left over from the World's Fair, so they let bids of $30 million to build the arena. And a man from Kansas City, B.B. Anderson, his company was the low bidder. Well, he no more than got in and started that he kept trying to raise the bid. And we got in, and the arena was brought to a halt. Nothing was happening. And there was about a 4-year lawsuit between USF&G, who had bonded B.B. Anderson, and the University of Tennessee. We had UT lawyers involved and a group of lawyers somewhere else. They had lawyers in Mississippi who specialized in these bonding issues. And this was going on about 4 years. Joe said it was the nightmare of a lifetime. And finally, the president of USF&G, a new president, called Joe and said, "Joe, I'd like to come meet with you." And the lawyers at UT were opposed to that, but Joe said, "I'll meet with you." He said, "I just want it to be me and you, no lawyers involved." And the man came down, visited Joe for an hour and a half, and he had worked out that deal, and it only cost the university about $2 million more, and USF&G took care of the rest of the money. But it took him 4 or 5 years to build the arena. 2 more stories. As you know, Joe was the greatest mentor you could ever have. Ron Kirkland told me, following Joe around one time when he was in the MBA physicians program, Joe told him, "Don't ever get mad unless you want to get mad." Joe told him, "Leaders must never demand respect, they must earn it." And he said, "You'll always trust the people who have your best interest at heart, but you have to earn their trust." And a quick story, early in his UT career, Dr. Holt was driving his olive-colored UT car, which had a 55-mile-an-hour governor on it. And he was driving Joe and Ed Bowling, the vice president for development, and Harold Reed, the vice president for business and finance. And he was taking them down to Tullahoma, where the UT Space Institute is located. As you'll recall, it's gone on, most of the astronauts who get advanced degrees got it through the UT, University of Tennessee Space Institute in Tullahoma. And the car ahead of them, had in it Herman Spivey, the great vice president for academic affairs, Dr. Hilton Smith, the great vice president for research, and Alvin Nielsen, the dean of liberal arts. And they followed them down. Now, when you rode with Dr. Holt, he would stop at the white store and he got grapes and apples and bananas and oranges, a turnip, whatever, and you'd eat in the car. And they get down to Tullahoma and they're parked behind these other three. And when they come out of this all-day meeting, Dr. Holt and them are in the car ready to go, but there's Herman Spivey getting in the car and Alvin Nielsen, Hilton Smith. And Joe said, boys, look at those three. He said, the future of the University of Tennessee is with those people. They're the people that can help make us better and greater. And Joe looked at him and he said, Dr. Holt, said, you're the president, Ed's vice president, Mr. Reed's vice. What are we? He said, son, we're the grape eaters. And that was typically Andy Holt, son, we're the grape eaters. And then once when Joe had announced, either in the press, he said something about, I'm going to run the university like a business, and Al Keeley came in, had a 20-page letter, and told Joe why you can't run. He said, pieces of the university you can run as a business, but always remember, the essence of a university is the unique, every student is unique, every professor is unique. And to have a great university, you got to have a great student body and great research. And my final thought, when Joe talked about, and this sort of hit me like a God moment, because Sunday our pastor was speaking about Jesus and the multitude, and Jesus was telling the multitude he was very angry with the Jewish religious leaders. And he said they wear cloaks, they have things wrapped their arms that hold prayers, and they tell you to do things that they won't do themselves. And but in verse 11 of Matthew 23, Jesus said, but he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And I said, wow, that's Joe Johnson. The greatest among you shall be your servant. And he was a great servant leader. And I thank you very much.
Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and moon and stars in their courses above join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy pardon for sin, and a peace that endureth, thy own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me.
Like others who've been before me, it's a real honor to be here this afternoon and spend a few minutes thanking Joe Johnson for the many community organizations he supported and advised over the years, both during his time as president of the university and in the decades of his retirement. I also need to thank Pat Johnson because, as Bill said, they discussed every day whatever Joe did that day, and I'm sure that he talked with her about the board meetings that he attended and the people that he had lunch with and all the advice that he handed out to nonprofit organizations all over the city. So I know that Pat's input is on a lot of the things that Joe did. The organizations that Joe served on boards and advisory boards and helped over the years are numerous, and a lot of them are well known to you. Home Federal Bank, UT Medical Center, South College, the Pat Summit Foundation, the Imagination Library, the Boy Scouts, the Museum of Appalachia, the Helen Ross McNabb Center, and the Knox Area Rescue Mission. There are also countless other organizations who benefited from Joe's advice, counsel, and encouragement. These organizations are known only to Joe and the staff and the board of those organizations that Joe met with. You know who you are, and your thank yous are included in what we're speaking about right now. Most of the time, those other organizations that weren't as prominent as the first list, you met in Joe's office for lunch. And we all know that Joe's office was the second table on the left on the upper level of Chesapeake's restaurant in downtown Knoxville. He was never too busy to mentor and share what he considered the basics of a strong community. And he believed that and backed it up with everything that he did. And by the way, Joe always paid for lunch, and then when he got back, he wrote you a thank you letter for coming to have lunch with him so he could help you with your organization. Joe raised a lot of money for a lot of people and a lot of organizations in the community. Obviously, UT was at the top of his list, and there are several folks here who could tell lots of stories about some of us who were actually in the room when Joe asked somebody for money. And one of his stories was, I asked him one time, and he said, well, Dr. Holt told me that if you ask somebody for money and they don't grab the arms of the chair and their knuckles turn white, you didn't ask them for enough. And Joe sort of lived by that. He also followed fundraising rule number 1, which is if you don't write a check yourself, you can't ask somebody else for a gift. And Joe always wrote the check. And there are lots of organizations in this community that benefited from Joe's advice, but also from the checks that he wrote. Quick story, Boy Scouts, Joe never quit making calls. Several years ago, we embarked on a fairly ambitious campaign to raise $5 or $6 million to build a new dining hall at the scout camp in Harriman at Camp Buck Tom's. We started the effort. COVID hit, campaign closed down. COVID's over, campaign's getting started again, and we were doing well. And I went to visit Joe at Little Creek, and the first thing he asked me, he said, "You haven't brought me any cards to work for this campaign." And I said, "Joe, we've put you on an emeritus status, and we're working your cards." Well, he pulled out about a 20-year-old flip phone. And Bill, I know what it was for now, because he said, the only thing I use this phone for is to call Pat every day and talk to her. He said, and I'm just laying here without a lot to do, and I can make some calls if you want me to. And I assured him that we were working his cards, but I did confess, I said, "Joe," I said, "I'm working some of the stack of cards that you used to work, and I'm telling everybody when I'm calling that I'm calling on behalf of Joe Johnson." And he said, "That's fine, and if they don't call you back, you call me, and I'll use my phone and I'll call them." So he never stopped making calls. Joe also had a great knack for recruiting volunteers for organizations, and I was the recipient of one of his calls. He called me, I had a lunch set up, and I've been involved with the Boy Scouts for a long time, and Joe called me and he said, "Well, we're supposed to have lunch tomorrow." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "We got some Boy Scout stuff to talk about." And I said, "Well, I kind of thought that's what it was about." And he said, "The nominating committee has met, and we've decided that you need to be president of the Boy Scouts." And I said, "Well, okay." And he said, "I'm calling you today to give you 24 hours to come up with the reasons why you don't want to do this." And he said, "And we're not going to accept any of them." And I said, "Well, okay, I guess that settles lunch tomorrow." And he said, "Yes, it does." And I said, "Well, are we still having lunch?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Do I have to pay for my own lunch now?" And he said, "No, I'm still buying lunch tomorrow." So not only did he advise organizations, raise money for them, but he also recruited leaders. And, when he called, it wasn't a yes or no answer. It was, "What have I just signed up for?" So Pat, Kelly, Bill, please know how grateful this community is for the generous and unselfish gift of time and treasure that Joe Johnson contributed to many organizations. His impact will be around for a long, long time, and he helped build viable nonprofit organizations in this community that'll be around for a long time, and we will forever be grateful. Thank you.
As has already been said, there are way more stories than time will allow. And Dr. Joe would have been the first one to say, "Let out on time." My relationship with Dr. Joe began in 2007. I moved from Orlando to be the senior minister for this church, the Laurel Church of Christ. And Dr. Joe was not he was not on the search committee, so he was not part of the hiring process. But he was one of the first people to reach out to me after I got here. He wanted to get to know the new preacher. So just a week or two after we had arrived, so this would have been about August or September of 2007, Dr. Joe said, "I want you to meet me at Chesapeake's, the special office." And I went, and we had a great meal, just a great visit. And he said, "Preacher, you need to know some things right up front." He said, "This is a very forgiving church. I want you to know that. You can make big mistakes. You can do things that would embarrass other churches, but we'll be fine with it. We can tolerate you. We'll love you. But you need to remember, we'll back you up if you remember two things. Number one, be sure to let us out on time." Emphasize that. Number one. And then he said number two, and he said, "I don't think I need to say this, but you did just move from Florida, so you need to know you are on your own if the words 'Go Gators' ever come from your lips." Just don't say it. Just don't say it. And I said, "Dr. Joe, that is really good advice. I appreciate your putting it on a level where I can understand it." So it was great. From a preacher's point of view, you could not have a finer church member than Joe Johnson. It's impossible. If you were to visit the Laurel Church on any random Sunday morning, the first 10 years that I was here, there was a very strong likelihood as you came in the door, the guy that met you and said, "I'm so glad you're here," and he handed you the order of worship, there was a very good possibility that that person was the Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Tennessee. That was his title at that time. I had one first-time visitor come in, and he said, pulled me aside. He said, "Brother Mark," he said, "that older gentleman at the door is very impressive." And I said, "You don't know the half of it." Joe and Pat have been amazingly generous with their time. Joe taught a Sunday school class for, we think, about 25 or 30 years. It was a long time. Nobody can remember. He taught a Sunday school class right down the hallway here, and we still, those of us sitting here still call that the Joe Johnson Sunday school class, because that's the impact he had. He was very generous with his finances. Anytime a special need arose, Joe and Pat were the first ones to contribute to it, whatever it was. Joe would talk it up. Anything that he thought was worthwhile and good, he'd talk it up, and he would encourage it, and he'd try to get other people to be involved. I regularly received notes of encouragement from Joe, so much so that it was almost embarrassing. I went through a period of about 3 years where I said, I'm just going to save everything that Joe sends me. And I had this file. It's got Wall Street Journal articles and comic strips and all these comments of one sort or another. And the thing just, in about 3 years, it was full up. I said, I can't keep up with the man. He is truly, truly amazing. If ever anybody earned the right to criticize the preacher, it was Joe Johnson. Because the old saying is, you don't really earn the right to criticize somebody until you've praised them a lot of times. If anybody ever earned that right, it was Joe Johnson, because nobody's ever praised me the way he did. But not once did he criticize. At least not to my face. He may have criticized. I've been in church work long enough, I know how that works. But he didn't say it to my face. We were having lunch at Chesapeake's one time. It became a regular occurrence. Every 3 or 4 months, we'd have lunch at Chesapeake's. And seemed like every time I'd have lunch with him, it was an experience of some sorts. One day, we're having lunch, and the university had just hired a new basketball coach. It was not Coach Barnes. It was one of his predecessors. And we're sitting and having lunch and chit-chatting. All of a sudden, the new basketball coach walks up, and he introduces himself to me. I thought, Southern hospitality is amazing. Only in the South does the basketball coach go around the restaurant introducing himself to random people that look like fans. And he introduces himself, and we start chit-chatting, and he says, "Well, what role do you have at the university?" And I said, "Coach, my role is to be Dr. Joe's preacher. We have lunch every 3 or 4 months. I give him whatever input he wants." And he said, "You have a really good job." And I do. I have an amazing job. We were having another lunch at Chesapeake's, and this very distinguished elderly gentleman walks up, and he says, "Young man," I was about 55 at the time, he says, "Young man," he says, "you need to be careful about who you are seen with in public." I said, "Sir, I will take that to heart." He kind of points to Joe. I said, "I'll take that to heart." I said, "I am Mark Smith. Who might you be?" He said, "I am Howard Baker." I said, "You mean Howard Baker, the used to be Senate Majority Leader?" He said, "I'm what's left of him." "Yep, I'm Howard Baker." I said, "You mean the Howard Baker Center? You're that guy?" He said, Yeah, that's me." And he said, "I'm telling you, this is good advice. Be careful about who you're seen with in public." And we laughed, and Joe laughed, and I went home that night, and I talked to my wife, as Joe always did with Pat, and I'd say, "Honey, you're not going to believe the conversation I had at lunchtime and who I had it with." It was like that all the time. Once a year, Dr. Joe would invite my wife and I to the Skybox. As his last few years were focused on fundraising and raising funds for the university, the Skybox became very important. When you have major donors, you have to treat them right and let them have a good experience. And so you may not be able to tell by looking at me, but I am not a major donor. I'm just going to confess it right now. My wife and I are pretty good at chit-chatting with people, but if you're looking for money, the cupboard is usually pretty bare. Yet, once a month, or once a year, excuse me, Dr. Joe would invite us to come and join him in the skybox for one of the ball games. That meant once a year, we got to go and chit-chat with some of the most high-profile, influential people in Tennessee. Truthfully, some of the most high-profile and influential people in the country. If you're looking at me and you're thinking, he looks familiar, think Skybox or Chesapeake's, one or the other. And it was just amazing to be able to chit-chat with billionaires. I was a nobody growing up. I grew up on the streets of Detroit. And the idea that I would ever be in the presence of some of the most influential people in the country, that was unthinkable growing up. The idea that I would chit-chat with some of the most influential people in the country was unthinkable. But it happened every year. Because the most significant things that have happened in my life, for the most part, had nothing to do with who I was. The most significant things that have happened in my life had everything to do with who I was with. I was with Dr. Joe. And he had an amazing, amazing capacity for making that special. Luke chapter 9, it's in your programs. We listed some of Dr. Joe's favorite passages. Luke 9:38, he loved to cite. It says, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among you all who is the greatest. Joe Johnson had such incredible influence over this community and over the country because he took those words to heart. He really believed it. He really believed that everybody has value. Everybody has worth. And everybody's important. And he treated every individual that he ever encountered with the respect and the dignity that God instills in all of us. My hope is that I can follow his example. Because that, folks, is a life that is worth celebrating. As Christians, we believe that an amazing transformation takes place when we leave this world, and we believe we've gone to there's a place waiting for us. It's special and it's amazing. But between here and there, we have a little bit of time to just be together. And Joe would say, use that time well. Be good to people. Treat everybody that you meet the way Jesus would treat them if he were in your shoes. We're going to pray to close, but Bill, Miss Pat, you want to stay here for after the thing, or would you prefer to go? You want to go out now? Okay. Oh, she's going to stay. Okay. The family is going to remain here, remain at the front of the worship center to greet those of you who may have come wanting to visit with them and speak with them and just did not have a chance. You will have the opportunity to do so as we dismiss. Let's stand together. I'm going to lead us in prayer, and our memorial will be finished. Father, we thank you for the amazing things that you bring our way, especially the amazing things that come to us through people. We thank you that men like Joe Johnson that we have a chance to interact with them and be friends with them and learn about what life is really all about. We confess to you that it is hard to say goodbye, even when somebody's lived as long and as productive a life as Dr. Joe did. It's hard to say goodbye. But we also believe that something better is waiting for us. And so we ask you to give us the peace that only you can provide. Help us to treat each other the way our dear friend Joe Johnson treated everybody else. And we believe if we can do that, that the world will be a much better place. And so watch over us and be with us in a special way. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. On behalf of the family, thank you for being here for this memorial.